Thank you for joining me. Today we are going to review for midterm one, but we're going to start with a review of Chapter 4, psychological measures. I'll cover this fairly quickly, and then just let me know if you have any questions. So for psychological measures, just to recap, in psychology, we are very careful about measuring things because most of the time what we're interested in are things that are intangible, right? Like happiness, joy, things like that. So it's really important that we operationalize these concepts carefully. So the whole idea of measurement is we're quantifying an aspect of human life and their characteristics. Psychometrics is the term that we often use for that. So again, just to clarify, psychological constructs is what we're interested in psychology. And these are usually things that we cannot observe directly. Feeling, for example, thinking, those are aspects of us that we actually have to infer from our behavior. So when we define constructs, we have two types of definitions. We have conceptual definition, and that's generally looking at or describing behaviors, feelings that are associated with the construct. When people are happy, they laugh, they have, a positive affect, they seem to be joyful, like all these kind of things. Now, that's conceptual. In a study, we have to operationalize that. So, an operational definition is specifically how a researcher is going to measure a particular psychological construct. Usually, it will involve some kind of time-bound aspect. For instance, the researcher will operationalize happiness by how many times the person being observed smiles in half an hour or in an hour. So you see that there's a really time-bound aspect to it. And that's because, we're trying to quantify it. So if one person smiles 10 times every 30 minutes and another person only smiles one time, right? That can give you an indication of how happy one person, between how much happiness there is between the two people. So the time-bound aspect is usually very important in an operational definition. When we talk about converging operations, because we are talking about psychological constructs that can be squishy, right? Because we're people. Um, Often we don't want to rely on only one kind of measure or observation to support the fact that this is the conclusion we're drawing about this person. So converging operations is when we'll say, okay, if they smile more than 5 times in half an hour and they are showing a smile, like they are laughing or they have a positive affect in the sense that there are no frowns, there's lack of any negativity, all these different ways that we are considering happiness, these different operationalizations come together to support the conclusion that this person is a happy person. So we actually want converging operations when we are studying a construct. So there are three main types of measures. We have self-report, which were very, the most common type of measure, which is surveys or interviews are a form of self-report. Behavioral, so that's something that we're actually observing in a person, something they're doing. And then we have physiological. So these would be things like the galvanic skin meter, blood pressure, maybe breathing rate, eye dilation. These are all body response recordings that we'll often engage in. So just to look at what a person, we're inferring what's going on. So self-report is fast, it's cheap, it's the most common way that we find out about people, but people can lie. So that's the drawback to self-report. Behavioral is nice because most of the time, as I mentioned in class, people only monitor the behavior for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then they go and do whatever they were going to do in the first place. So with behavioral, it's nice because it's very specific and obviously observable. Problem, again, is like sometimes people might modify what they're doing and if they know they're being observed. And then the last one, physiological, its advantage is that it's hard to deceive people with physiological readings. It's hard, like I don't know anyone who can control their eye dilation. Yes, we can control breathing to some extent, but blood pressure, all those things. It's hard to fake that. The drawback with physiological is that we have to infer what that means. So, for example, if somebody's heart rate goes up, well, we can't just base it on heart rate if we're saying that person is excited, because someone's heart rate can go up if they're fearful. Somebody's heart rate can go up if they're attracted to somebody. So there are many reasons why somebody's physiological body response readings might be elevated. And so we have to count on converging operations to support the conclusion that we're drawing from physiological observations. Any questions about this one? Okay. Um, just to recap, we have four scales of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So nominal and ordinal are considered qualitative scales, meaning that we don't have a numeric value associated with them. So nominal scale variables are categorical and they're just different. So it's like colors: blue, green, orange, yellow. Okay, they're different categories. They're all colors, but we're not putting them in any kind of order, right? So that's the idea with nominal. Ordinal scale variables are different, like categorical variables, but now we are ranking them. But the ranking doesn't have a quantitative component to it. In other words, the interval between the terms is not consistent. That's what I mean by that. So, for instance, in the Olympics, if we know who's in first place, second place, third place in a sprint, well, we know that the first place person got the fastest time. But the difference between the time of the first place person and second place person does not help us predict what the time is of the third place person. So that's what we mean by, okay, there is a ranking, but it's not consistent and it's really hard to quantify, to predictably quantify that difference. So for interval and ratio scale, these are the quantitative scale variables. So for interval scale variables, they are different like nominal. They are ranked like ordinal, but now the spaces between them are consistent. And that's why we call it an interval. So the intervals between the levels are predictable and consistent. An example we like to use is temperature, right? So we know that the difference between 0 degrees and 10 degrees is the same as the difference between 10 degrees and 20 degrees, right? It's actually predictable and measurable. However, in interval, the 0 is not, doesn't mean the absence of that variable. For instance, it's 0 degrees, it doesn't mean there's no temperature. And that's what we mean for that. Ratio scale variables are the ones we're very used to. Anything with counting, like how many books do you have, that kind of thing. And it's meaningful. The 0 is meaningful. So we call that an absolute 0. If I ask you, how many cars do you have? And you say 0, it means you don't have any cars. It's the actually absence of the variable. So with ratio scale variables, they are different, like nominal, ordered, like ordinal. The spaces between are consistent, like interval, but now you have the absolute 0. So that's anything where we're measuring in millimeters, grams, any kind of thing like that. That's a ratio scale variable. Any questions about the scales of measurement? Okay, so this is a nice summary here. As you can see, it kind of also gives you what kind of operations you can do. So with nominal scale variables, because there is no ranking, all we can say is something is equal or not equal. It's the same or it's not the same. That's all we can do. For ordinal, we can say something is less than or greater than because of the ranking component. With interval and ratio, we can do mathematical operations. With interval, we can do plus or minus, and then because ratio scale variable has the absolute 0, anything with decimals would be ratio scale, we can use multiplication division as well. All right, so let's talk about reliability. When we think about somebody who's reliable, a friend who is reliable, we're often talking about somebody who we can count on, somebody who we know will always be there, somebody who is consistent in our lives. So when we talk about reliability, we are usually referring to a specific measure. So remember, we had the self-report, we had the behavioral, and we had the physiological. With reliability, oftentimes we're talking about either a survey measure or some kind of observation. So test, retest reliability, right? That has to, so let's go back here. When we are measuring things, in psychology, we try to be conservative and we don't assume everything is perfect. So sometimes we know that there are going to be variations in what we measure just because of measurement error. So what we want to do is minimize measurement error, but we still want to acknowledge that it exists. And so that's why even if we do something repeatedly, if there's variation, we kind of have this little range, right? Of, okay, if it varies between 0 and 5, we know that could be measurement error. And so we're not going to throw out that score just because there's some variability. And that's that acknowledgement of measurement error. If we have a measure that's reliable, then the standard deviation is going to be very small. So that's what you see, that kind of like upright, very tight curve. That's a reliable measure. There shouldn't be a ton of difference among the scores in a reliable measure. However, if you have an unreliable measure, then you're going to have a huge standard deviation, right? So that's one red flag. If there's a lot of variability, then you want to question the reliability of that measure. So one way we look at reliability is test, retest reliability. Exactly what it sounds like. You are using the same measure or survey on the same people, and you're correlating their scores. And what you want to see is a really high correlation of 0.8 or higher. So what's the problem with this? Well, depends on when you do the retest. If you do the retest right away, then it could be that it's not because the measure is reliable, but it's because the person remembered a lot of the answers, right? So that's why it could be an issue of memory. So people know that there's going to be probably a little more variability if there's a long time in between the test retest situations. So that's one kind of reliability. Again, this would be for a survey measure. Then we have internal consistency reliability. So again, we're looking at a survey, and what we're doing now, this has to be a survey that is only on one construct. So for example, self-esteem. There is a self-esteem measure where every single item on it is supposed to relate to self-esteem. So the way we tell how reliable it is in terms of internal consistency is we can do a couple of things. We can actually split the measure in half and measure the first half of the survey scores, and then we measure the second half, the survey scores, and then we correlate them. If they're all about the same construct, then the correlation should be quite high. So that's split ability. We also have Cronbach's alpha, which has to do with internal consistency reliability. So here, what we're doing is we're taking all of these, so each item, right, you are correlating it with the item's total. So you have, let's say, 10 items on your measure. You're going to take item 1 and what their score is, and then compare it to the overall score. Take item 2, compare it to the overall score. So that's what we talk about, item total correlations. So if you hear something about Cronbach's alpha, again, we're looking at a 0.8 correlation or higher. Then we're talking about internal consistency reliability. So we have test, retest reliability. Now we have internal consistency reliability, and the term you want is Cronbach's alpha. The last type of reliability actually has to do with observations or even interpretations of qualitative data, and that is inter-rater reliability. So it sounds exactly what it says, inter-rater. So how much do these two different people who are rating observation or reading a transcript, how much do they agree on what it means? So this is really going to rely heavily on what we call a code book. And the correlation we want here is Cohen's kappa. So again, we want a 0.8 correlation or higher. To establish inter-rater reliability is a very iterative process. And let's say it's for a 5-minute observation. The code book is going to take everything that's going on in that observation and writing how to interpret it, because the raters are going to have the code book so that they can look and know how to interpret actions that are going on. So let's say it's an observation on children playing in the park. Then the code book might say, every time a child approaches another child with a pleasant expression on their face, that's an action of friendliness. When a child offers playground equipment to another child, that's an action of friendliness. So what you're going to have is many different things that can be interpreted as friendliness as possible. And so the code book can get very, very thick. And that's because first time people are watching this observation, they don't agree. They're going to talk about their points of disagreement and then write it down how they agree to interpret that action. So that ends up having a very thick code book, but that's how you establish inter-rater reliability. And that's really important for observational and qualitative studies. So again, 3 types of reliability: test-retest reliability, internal consistency reliability, in that we're talking about Cronbach's alpha, and then inter-rater reliability, which is Cohen's kappa. So you will need to be able to distinguish from among those 3 types of reliability. And if we're talking about an observation or interpretation of qualitative data, you're going to be thinking inter-rater reliability. When we think about a survey measure, and there's discussion about, maybe taking it over multiple times, then we're talking test-retest reliability. And then if we are talking about taking a look and analyzing the survey and the questions and seeing how things relate to each other, how the items relate to each other, now we're talking internal consistency reliability. Are there questions about reliability before we move on to validity?
Um, could you have like more examples of the different types of reliability?
I'm trying to think. So, okay, I mean, it's pretty standard in the sense of, okay, so there's a measure of depression, for example, and that's a 20 scale item. So if I were to establish test-retest reliability, I would give this measure of depression maybe at the beginning of the week, in the middle of the week, and the end of the week to the same people, and then correlate their scores. And I would expect them to be fairly even, right? If the person is not getting some kind of therapy or whatever. So that's test-retest reliability. Test-retest reliability does not tell you the time frame in which you're going to do the retesting. We know that the longer the time frame, the less likely they're going to remember the questions, right? But you don't want it to be too long because a lot of other changes can happen. So we call that maturation or history. If things are happening outside of the testing you're doing that can affect people's scores, then that's gonna be an issue, right? So test-retest reliability, you don't want to do the retesting you don't want to just have too much time in between, but you don't want it to be too soon either, where they're memorizing the questions. So with test-retest reliability, it's just some kind of indication that the same people are getting the same measure multiple times. That's test-retest reliability. Interrate, internal consistency reliability, you're basically analyzing the survey. So you are looking at what is the score, overall score on, let's say, the Beck, depression inventory. And then what if you just took the score of each one or each item and compared it? Or more likely, if you just do half of the questions, what would their score be on that? And the second half of the questions, what would this people's score be on that? And you correlate them. Internal consistency. So internal consistency reliability is what you would do if you want to make sure that this survey is asking only about depression and nothing else. That's the only time that it's going to be helpful. So for test-retest reliability and internal consistency reliability, those are for survey measures. Inter-rater reliability is only for observations or transcripts. So I gave you the example of, people observing children in a park, right? Like, how do you decide how many times, how friendly these kids are? You have to break it down with the code book, be able to interpret everything they're doing. Another way you do inter-rater reliability is in a transcript. So let's say the study had to do with a conversation between people and how their relationship was or something like that. Now you're going to have a conversation, you're going to be looking at a transcript, and a code book would now be telling you how to interpret certain statements that they're making. And this could get very, very involved, right? I have a colleague who analyzed transcripts to the point of how long pauses were occurring, how long it was taking people to respond to a question. So there are many ways you can analyze qualitative work. So inter-rater reliability, what that is talking about is having at least two different people come to the same conclusion about what this certain data means. And the data would be something qualitative, like watching people or reading a transcript. I'm not sure, like you need to tell me what you don't understand about these three reliabilities, because I don't know what other examples I can give you.
That's all I really want. Just more examples, I guess.
Okay.
I think I get it now.
Any other questions, Max or Brittany? All right, so I'm going to move on to validity. Um, this one is, it's a doozy, and it's going to be with us the entire semester. So it's very important that you can distinguish from among these different types of validity. So there are four main validities: construct validity, statistical validity, internal validity, and external validity. Okay, so construct validity is you establishing that if it's about happiness, how are you going to kind of show people that you're really studying happiness and it's not something else that's related to happiness? So this is where we talk about construct validity. And construct validity, there are different ways that you can do this. So face validity is just, it seems like the questions make sense in asking about happiness. Content validity, on the other hand, that means that you are looking at all the different aspects of happiness and making sure that it's included. And then we have criterion validity, and that has to do with empirical support for what you are doing. So these are different types of construct validity. All three of them, face, content, and criterion, are to establish that, yes, you really are studying happiness when you say you're studying happiness. That is the construct, the psychological construct that you have is truly is authentic. Okay, so that's construct validity. Internal validity pertains to the research design. How confident are you that the conclusions you are drawing from the manipulation of the independent variable, whatever change in the dependent variable, is really happening because of how you designed the study? So construct validity is what you're studying. Internal validity is how you are studying it. External validity has to do with your results. Are these results that you got, will they actually be applicable to other populations, other contexts? Because if it's only applicable to the sample, it's not very helpful to anybody else, right? So very different validities. And then statistical validity has to do with the analysis of the data you collected. So very different components of a study. So face validity, again, it's just, does it seem like it really reflects what you say it does? So it's a very kind of subjective, extremely subjective type of validity. I don't particularly like it, right? Um, Content validity, on the other hand, goes a step up. So it's more than just, yeah, it looks like it really is about happiness. Now we are talking about different aspects that we're going to look at. So the example I have here is intelligence. If we're saying we're studying intelligence, there are a lot of different dimensions involved with intelligence. It's not just IQ. Part of it is intelligence quotient. Part of it is how quickly can people process new information. That's a part of intelligence. Memory, people who have a large memory capacity tend to do extremely well on intelligence tests. Creativity is another aspect to intelligence and curiosity. So when we are talking about a construct, we're going to look to the research, to previous research, to give us an idea of what are the different aspects that need to be included if we are going to do research on this particular construct. So face validity is just, yeah, it seems like it makes sense. Content validity is deeper. We're looking at previous research to help us establish that yes, we actually covered all the different aspects of this construct we're interested in. So if we're talking about intelligence, we include these components that other research studies have shown to be part of intelligence. If we're talking about happiness, then we need to include all the different aspects that other studies have shown and established to be part of that construct. Again, psychological constructs a little bit squishy, so that's why it's really important that as researchers, we try to demonstrate to the audience and anyone reading our papers that we've put a lot of effort and work into it and want to capture as much of that as possible. Any questions about face or content validity? Okay, so now criterion validity. Now we're talking about empirical support. So empirical evidence of a measure's validity. Now we're talking about correlations here. So here now this has to be obviously a quantitative component. So how did people do on an IQ test? How did people do on this Beck, depression inventory, things like that. So there are four subtypes, actually five subtypes of criterion validity. One is concurrent validity. So the word concurrent means happening at the same time. Let's say I am not happy with the way the IQ scores are established. We're like, this is culturally biased. It's kind of old-fashioned. It's not really relevant to people today. And I want to create a new IQ score, a new IQ test. So what I would do is I would get a fairly large sample, diverse sample of people, and I'm going to give them the old IQ test at the same time as I give them my new IQ test. And what I'm going to do is correlate their scores. And what I want is a high correlation. If there's a high correlation between the scores of the old IQ test and the new one, then I have really strong evidence that my new measure of IQ is legitimate, that it's actually measuring IQ as well or better as the old IQ test. So concurrent validity, the key there is that it's happening at the same time in the same setting. That you're having two different measures correlate with each other and they were from data collected at about the same time. Predictive validity, now we're talking about something that is happening today, data we're collecting today, and it's going to help us anticipate behavior in the future or some kind of outcome or measure in the future. People's high school GPA has very good predictive ability in terms of are they going to graduate with a college degree. Sometimes people take an aptitude test and how well they do on that aptitude test can be correlated with their job ability in the future. So the idea with predictive validity is, do these scores that we are collecting, how consistently and accurately can they help us anticipate a future behavior? That's predictive validity. Convergent validity, we are looking again for positive correlations. So all these three, we're looking for positive correlations. And now we could be collecting converging operations. So maybe it could be measures from related constructs, and we want to see a positive correlation between them. So creativity is an aspect of intelligence. So maybe we would expect a measure that's just on creativity to correlate highly with our measure of intelligence. Or we can be collecting, intelligence scores from different studies and seeing a correlation between that too. So convergent validity is different from concurrent validity because it does not have to be at the same time. Concurrent validity has to be data collected at the same time. That's the biggest difference between concurrent and convergent validity. And then the last one is discriminant validity. So whereas concurrent, predictive, and convergent validity are all looking for positive correlations, with discriminant validity, we're trying to establish that this is different from this other construct, and now we're looking for negative or low correlations. So with criterion validity, we are looking for quantitative support, right? The other types of validity is not the same. So in many ways, criterion validity is going to be really closely tied to reliability. Not the same thing, though. Something can be reliable and not valid. For example, if I had a scale that was always off by like 5 pounds or something, I could reliably go and it'll give me the same, weight consistently, but it's not valid because it's inaccurate, right? So it's possible for a measure to be reliable, meaning it'll give us, roughly the same scores. It could be test retest reliability, but it could not be valid. Maybe it's not actually testing happiness like we say it's testing happiness. Maybe it's actually testing for something else. So you want to make sure you understand that reliability and validity are not the same. They're not the same thing. Reliability is part of validity, but it is not equal to validity. Any questions? So again, we have base validity, we have content validity, and we have criterion validity. These three are all part of construct validity. You should have all three. Ideally, you want to establish that you have all three in a measure that you in your study. So here indicators of construct validity, right? So base validity, content validity, predictive validity is part of it. Predictive is part of criterion validity. Concurrent, convergent, and discriminant validity. So base, content, and criterion validity are three main subtypes. Predictive, concurrent, convergent, and discriminant are subtypes of criterion validity. And yes, you need to be able to distinguish from among the different types of validity. So the last two main types are internal and external validity. So internal validity, again, that has to do with your subject design. So how confident are researchers in saying that it's because of the way we put together the study that we are able to draw these conclusions legitimately? That's what we're talking about with internal validity. With external validity, now we're talking about the results being able, like if we said, oh, it seems that when you take away food from people, you take away the visual cues, they eat more. Is that true everywhere, right? So that's the external validity part. You want to show that, yes, these results I got are actually going to bear out if we went to different restaurants and we conducted the study, regardless of the type of cuisine, whether it's Mediterranean or Asian or American or, that doesn't matter. Um, the studied results work for everybody. That's establishing external validity. Now, it's important to understand that when you have internal validity, you establish that by having a lot of control in your study. You're ruling out alternative explanations. But the more control you have in a study, the higher your internal validity, the lower your external validity. Because the real world is messy. The real world is not so controlled. The real world is not some kind of lab where you can make everything sterile, right? So that's always the trade-off. If you have to choose between the two. So among the research designs, experiments have the highest internal validity because there's manipulation of the independent variable. When we manipulate the independent variable, then we can say, oh, it's only after we changed something in the independent variable did our measure of the dependent variable change as well. That's part of internal validity. That's part of the research design. So among the different research designs, internal validity has the strongest. I mean, experiments have the strongest internal validity, but they have weaker external validity. So Stanford Prison Experiment, very strong internal validity. Why? Because their participants were as homogeneous as you could possibly made them. They were all the same age group, all the same demographic in terms of, middle class guys. They even did a battery of psychological tests to make sure that they were psychologically as similar as possible, that then none of them had any violent tendencies or anything. So the control that was exerted in that study was very high, high internal validity. External validity, though, people could argue that, well, the way these guys behaved, it's because they were all, guys, they were all white males, college-age white males. That's not necessarily going to be true for other people, right? So people could say that because the sample size was not diverse, that the external validity was lower. However, because it was so powerful, the effects that we saw, that's still a highly cited study in terms of the power of social roles and behavior. So if you have to choose between the two, I would say go for the stronger internal validity because you can establish external validity by replicating the study with different populations. That's how you do it. Just replicate it and extend it with different populations. So obviously, if there weren't ethical problems, maybe people would say, oh, they should do a Stanford prison experiment with women or with men of color or with different age groups, that's how you establish external validity. So with internal validity is how much control do you have? How much can you rule out alternative explanations because you are that confident in your research design? With external validity, now we're talking about the results. Can these results be applied to others? So again, we have four main validities, right? We have internal validity, as I mentioned. We have external validity. We have statistical validity, which has to do with the analysis. How appropriate is the analysis for what you've done? And we have construct validity, which is, are you actually studying what you say you're studying? So let me see. Construct validity is broken down into the different types. We have face validity, we have the criterion validity, and we have content validity. So it's not in these slides. Questions about validity? No questions? Okay, let's do some testing. Okay. What type of variable? So feel free to just unmute and say what you think it is. So we're talking about nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. What type of variable is it if we are measuring the degree of pupil dilation in a person's eyes? Nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio?
It's ratio, right?
Correct. Yes, it is, because we're measuring in millimeters. So if we have zero dilation, then it hasn't expanded, right? It's actually meaningful. How about number of books a person owns?
Ratio?
Yes, because someone says zero, it means they don't own any books. How about a book sales rank on Amazon.com?
Ordinal?
Yes. Now, why did you choose ordinal and not anything else? What made you think it's ordinal and not interval?
Well, first because it's like a rank, and then also it can't be zero because like there's uh just gonna like you can't have like a 0th place, I guess, in a ranking, or otherwise you wouldn't be in it at all.
Mm.
Um,
And then it doesn't help, like knowing something is in first place doesn't actually tell you how many books second place or third place got, right? So it's not
yeah.
predictable. Good. Location of a person's home, urban, rural, suburban.
Nominal because it's like a category.
Yep, you're right. How about a student's letter grade in school? That would be interval because you don't have a zero, right? But it's consistent because the difference between A and B is the same as the difference between B and C. So that's why it would be interval. Any questions about this one? Okay, so sorry, let me skip on to reliability. All right. If a researcher finds that people's scores on a measure of extroversion stay stable over 2 months, what kind of reliability is that?
Test retest.
Yes. Great. What if an infancy researcher is measuring how long a 3-month-old baby looks at a stimulus on the right and left sides of a screen? What kind of reliability do you need to establish?
Is that internal consistency? Or
No, it's not.
no? Oh.
That's internal consistency would be for a survey. So this is not a survey.
Oh, it's observational. So inter-rater?
Yes, that's right. It is observational, it's inter-rater. So we'd have to get at least two different people to say what this baby's doing. A researcher asked a sample of 40 people a set of 5 items that are all capturing how extroverted they are. Chromebox alpha for the 5 items is 0.65. So what kind of reliability is that?
Internal consistency?
Yep, you got it. Questions about this? Is there anything about this you do not understand? Okay, let's go with validity. Professor gives a class of 40 people his 5-item measure of conscientiousness with how many times a student has been late to class in a semester. So what kind of validity are we looking at? So the average scores are correlated, sorry, with how many times a student has been late. So he gave his class this thing of conscientiousness and then looked and compared how often they were late to class, how their score on the conscientiousness scales and how often they were late. So what kind of validity are we looking at?
Discriminant because it's negatively correlated, right?
Well, it is negative, but did he expect to get negative scores? So it's negatively correlated, so it ended up being that way, but actually it would be
Is it?
convergent.
Oh, never mind. I thought it was something else. Oops.
It's actually convergent because what we're doing now is we are looking at different measures supporting each other in terms of this conclusion we're coming up with the kids. Does that make sense? So we have a survey measure and we have their behavior. And together, their behavior in conjunction with the score that they got on conscientiousness helps support a conclusion that we're drawing about these kids. Okay, that's convergent validity. We're taking different types of information and we're pulling them together to help us make a conclusion. Now, the fact that it's negative means that, okay, there isn't really a good relationship, but we weren't intentionally looking at, so you do discriminate when you have constructs that you want to show, they're not the same thing, right? But it's convergent because we were thinking that how many times they're late to class is going to be related to how conscientious they are. So that's why it's convergent validity. How about other measures we're taking at the same time? The scores are more highly correlated with a self-report measure of tidiness than with a measure of general knowledge.
Is it content validity?
So content validity, we're actually not talking about numbers. When we're talking about correlations, those are going to be a type of criterion validity.
Okay.
Type of criterion validity, but which ones? Remember, there were 4 types of criterion validity.
Concurrent, right? Because it's at the same time.
Yes,
Oh.
and discriminant, because we were trying to show that being T is a little bit different. So that's why it's concurrent and discriminant. So the scores, other measures were taken at the same time. The scores are more highly correlated with a self-report measure of tidiness. So that would be conscientious tidiness. That is and discriminant than with the measure of general knowledge. So they're trying to show that being conscientious is not the same as being intelligent. That's what it was showing. Okay. Make sure, like, do you have questions about this? Let's talk. No? All right, let's move on. Researcher emails his 5-item measure of conscientiousness to 20 experts in personality psychology and asks them, do they think they're a good measure of conscientiousness? What kind of validity is that?
That'd be face validity, right? Because it's asking what they think.
Yes. Okay. So the other one, that the question was, why is it discriminant? It's discriminant because, sorry, let me go back to this other one. It's comparing conscientiousness with general knowledge, and they're trying to establish that it's not the same thing. So when the intent is to show that constructs are different, then it's called discriminant validity. If the intent is to show that they are similar or supportive of each other, then we're talking convergent validity. And now, if we're doing something at the same time, then we're talking concurrent validity. Just want to make sure that's clear. Okay, the researcher emails his 5-item measure of conscientiousness to 20 experts and asks them if they think he has included all the important aspects of conscientiousness. So what kind of validity is that?
This one is content because he's asking if he has enough, all the aspects, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yay.
Right. So let me stop sharing for a second, and then I'll bring up another review. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of validity. Any questions while I'm also looking for a review? Did that help, hopefully?
Yeah, it helped. It helped a lot.
Okay, good, 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 good. Let me see. I know I have a review. Sorry. While I'm looking for the review slides, any other things you want me to cover again or questions? That's what I'm here for. This is like validity is definitely a part that all students kind of struggle with. But we'll be talking I think it will make more sense when we talk about different research designs. Then it kind of, it's like, oh, okay, now I get what they're talking about, right? But getting comfortable with these different terms is really important, and feeling like you get a good sense of how they're different. I know there are a lot, and I wish I could tell you, um, you know, this is the magic way to remember all the different ways. It's really kind of like just really understanding the differences between them. So again, what are the 4 validities? 4 main validities. Come on. We just looked at it. Nobody remembers? We have internal, external, statistical, and construct. Those are the 4 main types of validity. And then the construct validity is divided into smaller, like sub construct validities. You have face validity, content validity, and criterion validity, right? And then criterion validity is subdivided into those different, the other types of validity, which are concurrent, convergent, and discriminant. And no, why am I blanking on the other one? There's one more and I can't remember it right now. But you have to know the different subtypes as well. Okay, so I have like a little bit of a review. Share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. All right, here we go. So just to remember, what are the features of science, right? We have skepticism, meaning that we don't just believe things because people say it's happening. We have systematic empiricism, so we are intentionally, oops, sorry. Sorry, I think I pressed on something and I don't see it anymore. What are you looking at right now? Sorry, I did something.
We're still looking at the review.
Okay, I don't know why I'm not seeing that. Okay, and then we have empirical questions, meaning falsifiable questions, and then publication so that you're sharing the results with others. Because the whole idea about research is that we want to contribute to the body of knowledge and understand things better. We have the 4 goals: describe, explain, predict, control. So describe is when you're like, what is happening? What are the variables involved? That's all that you're doing there. You're not trying to establish anything else. You're just trying to understand the phenomenon. With explain, it's why is it happening? So now that you have the variables that you know what's involved, why is this phenomenon even happening? Prediction is when will it happen again? So now we're trying to establish which variables are going to help us anticipate what happens in the future. And then control would be like, how can it be changed? So those are the different goals of science. Any questions about this one? All right. Types of bias in research. So when we talk about bias, it is what is impacting our researchers or the results because of, pre-existing attitudes towards this construct, right? When we talk about research bias, it could be something that's going on. It's going to impact the quality of our research because either the design is biased or the way we interpret the results are biased. So those are kind of dangerous. So you could have what we call pre-trial bias, meaning even before you conduct your study, what are things that can go wrong? Well, maybe the design has some flaws in it. Also, there's selection bias, which means that you are drawing your sample from a group that isn't representative of the general population. So that could be selection bias. We have information bias, meaning you're only paying attention to information that already supports your hypothesis. So that's like a type of confirmation bias. And of course, in research, you want to reduce the existence of those biases. This you should know. This is the model of scientific research. What are involved in the steps? What do these steps entail? So first, it starts off with either informal observations or some problem that needs to be solved. Then you come up with a question. Remember, all research questions have to have an element of originality. They should also be interesting and feasible. When you look at when you figure out what your research question is, then you go to the literature, see what's already been done, and then you're going to tweak your question to make sure that it is original. That's why you have that kind of iterative process there. Then once you've got an original research question that is interesting and feasible, now you conduct your study, analyze your data, come to your conclusions, and then now you have more knowledge about this construct that you wanted to know about, and you can, start over again with another research question. So that is essentially the model of scientific research. Any questions here? All right, you should know what a theory is. So theory is a coherent explanation of some sort of phenomenon that's going on. It's usually based on some ideas, assumptions, observations, generalizations that people have made over years. And what the reason why we like to use theories is it provides a framework. We have all this data. It actually guides us. When we have a theory in mind, it guides us to what kind of data we're collecting, what kind of observations we could be making, and also helps us to organize our study in a way. And it helps us to test hypotheses. That's why we love theories in psychology. So theories are very general, right? They organize observations into kind of a coherent way of interpreting them. The purpose of a theory is to explain patterns and things that we have observed. On the other hand, hypotheses are very specific to a study. And it's usually a hypothesis is something that we want to test, right? There's an aspect of a theory that we want to test, and we conduct a study to determine it. So with a hypothesis, remember, we don't talk about proving or disproving. In psychology, we talk about supporting. So we have a hypothesis. Usually there's some kind of direction. It's some sort of prediction of how we think it's going to turn out. You never have a study without any hypotheses, right? Hypothesis testing is kind of the basis of what we're doing in research. So here's the difference. With a theory, it's very broad. The idea is it can be applied to many contexts and populations, right? It explains something that we are observing or not observing. For example, social identity theory is a theory that tells us how we believe being members of certain groups is going to impact a person's identity. Hypothesis, on the other hand, where a theory is broad, a hypothesis is very specific. And usually with the hypothesis, we are making a prediction and it's based on the theory that we're testing. Any questions about the difference between a theory and a hypothesis? All right, so what else do we have in a research study? Well, we have variables. Those are the things that we want to study. And it's called a variable because it changes. If it didn't change, we would call it a constant, right? So we also want to keep in mind what are the scales of measurement? Are they going to be qualitative, meaning they will be nominal or ordinal, or are they going to be quantitative? And it's really important to establish this in a study because it's going to impact how we analyze things. What else is in a study? We have to have a conceptual definition, right? How are we understanding this construct? And we're going to be doing citations of previous studies and theories. Now, based on that, the next step is we have an operational definition. How in this study are we specifically going to measure this construct that we're interested in? How are we going to know how happy somebody is in this study? That's the operational definition. So make sure you really understand the difference between a conceptual definition and an operational definition. Also, you should know the difference between a population and a sample. So it is impossible for us to get the entire population of any group. We are always looking at samples in research. So there are different ways that we can sample, and we're going to talk more about this in chapter 7 on surveys. So simple random sampling is if everybody in the population has an equal chance of being selected to be part of the study. Doesn't happen very often. Convenience sampling is exactly what it sounds like. It happens because it's easy for the researchers to get these participants. And we'll talk about other methods in chapter 7. Any questions about the elements of a research study? Okay, so this is kind of a preview of what we're going to be doing after the midterm. But research approaches, experimental. The reason we conduct experiments is to determine cause. It is the only type of research design that can do that, to establish causation. We have manipulation of the independent variable. We measure the dependent variable. Extraneous variables, remember, are variables that exist but are not part of our study. And then you have confounding variables, which are a special type of extraneous variable that we want to avoid. It's called confounding because it actually moves, it changes its value along with the independent variable and the dependent variable. And then we are confused, like, oh, wait a minute, is the dependent variable changing because of the manipulation of the independent variable, or is it changing because of this this confounding variable? So a good researcher can anticipate what variables would be confounding and then control for them or eliminate them. Non-experimental studies are used for description, explanation, and prediction in terms of the goals of science. All right, chapter 3, we talked about ethics. So certain codes that we reviewed. The Nuremberg Code was the first one that came out of the Nazi trials. And what did it give us? Well, it told us we need to really weigh the risks and benefits. How important is it that we gain this knowledge if it's going to harm our participants, right? So that's what the Nuremberg Code came up with. It also made us think about the importance of informed consent, that people who participate in our studies should know what to expect. That's the idea of informed consent. Then we have the Belmont report, and that came after the Tuskegee study. And what did we gain from that was the idea that we need to respect our participants, which is really sad that we had to like explicitly say this because it's not happening automatically, right? So principle of respect for persons, that means we understand that participants should be able to leave anytime they feel like they're not comfortable. And we also want them to be informed of what they're getting into. We also have the principle of beneficence. Beneficence means benefit to society. Non-malfeasance means no harm. So we want to maximize the benefit to society and want to minimize the harm to participants. We have the principle of justice, meaning that those who participate in the studies should also be benefiting from it. So those are the main things we got from the Belmont report and the Nuremberg Code. The Institutional Review Board is required by the federal government for any institution that gets federal money. If people who are in these hospitals, schools, nonprofit organizations, they want to conduct studies, then we have to have an institutional review board. And the goal of that is to protect the human subjects. So this, again, any institution that receives federal funds is required to do this in order to conduct studies on people and living things. What do? They review what we call research protocols, and they want to make sure there are no ethical violations in it. So they look very carefully. How are you going to treat your participants? How are you recruiting them? How are you protecting the information that you're getting from them? All of those things they are looking at in a research protocol. The Institutional Review Board has at least 5 people. We want them to be varying backgrounds. So we don't want all scientists, right? We actually want a bunch of different people because more perspectives we have, the more likely it is we'll be able to determine if there's anything ethically problematic with the study. And we also want there to be at least one person who is not affiliated with the institution, again, maximizing the likelihood that we can have members who will speak up if we think there's any kind of problem with the study. Any questions about the Institutional Review Board? All right, types of research. You should know this. Exempt means no risk, right? Means no informed consent is required. Minimal risk or expedited. So if you are going to take some kind of recordings on your participants, like their weight or height, then it would go minimal risk. And then you have greater than minimal risk. So you have exempt. That's the fastest way that you get through IRB. You're not even interacting with usually this would be an observation where you're not even talking to them. Or you're looking at archival data. Again, you're not interacting with people. Exempt, then you have minimal risk, which is kind of the risk of harm is no more than, what they would do on a daily basis. And then you have greater than minimal risk. So here you have the full IRB is going to be required. You might have to adjust your protocol to show that you're really being ethical with your participants and their data. So that kind of review takes a little bit longer. So those are three types of research: exempt, minimal risk, and greater than minimal risk. Any questions? All right, so here are the 5 ethical principles and how they mapped onto the Belmont report. So you should know the different ethical principles, be able to identify, which principle is being discussed, or maybe give an example of it. Right. So the fact that there are 5 of them is like, whoa, this could be a really good matching question. So keep that in mind. This is beneficence and non-malfeasance, meaning we are going to benefit society as much as possible without hurting anybody. Fidelity and responsibility is how is the researcher treating the participants. So you want to make sure that you are respectful and you're being, you're on time, you're doing all that. Integrity has to do with the data. You're not going to falsify the data. Justice is that the participants and the beneficiaries of the research should be from the same group. And then respect for people's rights and dignity. So that can be at multiple levels, but it also includes protecting confidentiality and patient information. Questions about the ethical principles? Okay, let me see what else. Make sure you know the experiments, right? So, oh, sorry. We have Little Albert, the Tuskegee trials, Milgram's obedience study, and the Stanford prison experiment. So you want to make sure that you have all of those, know them well enough that you can talk about, what were their research goals? What were their problems? And so look back on the discussion component that we covered online. Here's that breakdown. I was looking for this. Okay, so we have validities, 4 main validities: internal, external, construct, and statistical. Construct validity is broken down into face, content, and criterion. And then the criterion validity is broken down into concurrent, predictive, convergent, and discriminant. Any questions about this one? Okay, so what I'm going to do now is go to the study guide so that we can see if there's anything, that you have any burning questions about. So hopefully you were all looking at the study guide. Remember that you can use the cheat sheet, the 1-page handwritten cheat sheet to help you on the exam. You need to make sure that Proctorio is actually, installed correctly. I reopened the extra credit so you could test it. All right, so you want to make sure that you have that down. Here it is. Here is, whoops, hold on a second. That's not what we want because you're not doing an in-person study guide. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here is the study guide. We went over the methods of acquiring knowledge, right? So that would be intuition. What are the other components? We have intuition, authority, rationalism, empiricism, and scientific method. Definition of science, what are the features? I went over that earlier. So pseudoscience has aspects of real science and it's missing something. So that's what you need to keep in mind. It's like, it's called pseudoscience and it's very tricky because they tend to use scientific terms, but many times it's not falsifiable. There isn't a lot of empirical research in it. There's no publication of it. There are different aspects to it that make it pseudoscience. Talked about bias in research already. Basic research is research that is conducted just to learn more about the human condition. Applied research is research that is conducted to solve a problem. So that's a big difference between them. If, for instance, why did children like the color blue? That would be basic research. Applied research would be, if we paint the slide blue, will it increase the use of the slide, right? So you're using understanding to solve a problem. So that's with applied research. Talked about the general model of research, those 6 steps. We talked about the theories. Scholarly research literature is targeted at an academic audience. It's not pretty. It's black and white. Most you'll see are graphs, right? And the writing level is higher. Non-scholarly sources are meant for the general public, usually written at about 5th grade level, usually have pretty pictures to make it interesting. Generally speaking, scholarly research, it's going to have a lot of citations, and it is really meant for a much more serious look at a certain, psychological construct. Non-scholarly sources, unfortunately, don't often have citations and are more anecdotal in nature. Research question, you have to make sure your research question is interesting and feasible. So interesting meaning it's not something that can be easily answered with a yes or no answer. Has to have a lot of depth and dimension to it. Feasibility means, can you actually do the study? So collecting 20,000, a sample of 20,000 might not be feasible, right? Or if a study would be really cool, but it's going to take 50 years to learn the answer, that might not be feasible. So those are the kind of things we mean about feasibility. We talked about the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. Went over the different types of variables. And we did experimental, non-experimental. So lab studies are obviously done in a laboratory. They have the highest internal validity, but low external validity because everything's so controlled. A field study would be something more naturalistic in the environment. So again, that increases external validity, but decreases internal validity. So field experiment is kind of the best of both worlds where you have more of a balance between the two. And I already talked to you about why we don't use the word proof or disprove. Research ethics, we went over that. The APA principles, and yes, you need to know these 4 studies. Measures, chapter 4, we went over earlier, and I have the recording for that as well. So what are some tips? Make sure you're looking not only at the textbook, but also the content pages. That's why I built them. It's because I want to give you a little bit more meat than what the textbook has. So the content pages are fair game for the exam. So keep that in mind. Both the textbook and content pages and lecture slides would be part of that, right? Review the homework assignments and the keys, because that's going to help you as well. And in this short answer, make sure that you are explaining, right? That way I can give you partial credit. If all you do is a really short, 1 or 2 words, and if it's wrong, then I can't really do anything for you. So you want to make sure you explain all your answers in the short answer part. Also, the short answer questions, if you take it a second time, they're probably going to be different from the first time you took it. So do not write, same answer is my previous test. I've had students do that and it really just messed them up because it wasn't the same question. They thought it was the same question, but it wasn't. So make sure you take the time to answer all the short answer, especially if you do it the second time around, right? Possible matching short answer topics, ways of knowing. That would be easy matching, right? Also, for short answer, if it's a short answer question, be able to give an example of it, or maybe compare what's the difference between knowing through authority and knowing through empiricism, right? Scientific goal, again, be able to give an example of a study demonstrating each goal. So think about that. What if I said I want to do a study with the goal of explanation. Describe a study that would do that. That could be a short answer. And then explain why you think that this is an appropriate example. I can't reiterate enough to you. Please explain your responses in the short answer component. Scientific research process and method. So there are 6 steps in the scientific process. Maybe I'll say, give me an example of the step of, informal observations. What would you do there? Types of validity, you better believe there will be questions, lots of questions on validity and reliability. So make sure you can identify the type and be able to give an example of it. So if we're talking about internal validity, what does that mean? Well, you can give the example, oh, in the Stanford prison experiment, there was high internal validity because they had a very homogeneous sample. Like, give me some kind of something to go with. IRB, composition purpose, we talked about that, right? So when we say composition, who's part of the IRB? Well, we talked about that. At least 5 people. They should be from varying backgrounds. There should be somebody who is not part of the institution, like those kind of aspects. What do they do? Well, they're protecting participants. That's the main part. They're reviewing studies, making sure there's nothing unethical going on. The APA ethical principles, so there are 5 of them, as I mentioned. That makes it a really nice, easy matching potential. Make sure you know what the principles are. Give me an example of how it would be, applied, or even maybe you might have to connect it with one of those 4 studies. So think about that. So that discussion, I think it was discussion 2, where we talked about the ethical principles. You might want to review that one. And then scales of measurement. Nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Make sure that you can give examples of them, be able to distinguish the differences. So nominal is categorical, ordinal is ranked. Interval has the predictable spaces between the values, and then ratio is what we're used to with the meaningful 0. Any questions? No questions means y'all got it, right? Anything at all? I'm here to answer. Okay. I like the thumbs up. Wonderful. That makes me happy.
How long should the short answer questions be?
Well, you do have a limit. So I would say maybe like 3 or 4 sentences. So you don't want to write a dissertation, right? Because you have a time limit. Also, like, be conscious of the time limit so that you make sure you have time to do the short answer. Turn off all your notifications, because that could be problematic, especially those who have Mac products. If you turn it off on your computer, but something goes off on your phone, it's going to show up on your computer, right? So you want to make sure you turn off all the notifications. You have 2 chances. You want to have your handwritten cheat sheet and nothing else around you. What else? I do really recommend that you take it 2 times, because people generally score better second time. Again, the questions probably won't be the same, but just going through it the first time, there's the nerves, you don't know how I ask questions, things like that. And then afterwards, it's like, oh, okay, I get a sense of what it is. And also you might be like, oh, I need to study this part more. And then you have time. So it's going to open midnight tonight and be available all the way through Saturday night. I'm going to give you basically 2 days to take it. So please take advantage of that, right?
On Canvas, it said it opened today and it closes tomorrow.
Oh, so it should have been tonight and closes Saturday. So I could change that. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, I certainly hope you all do well. I will be in a lot of meetings, but I'm going to monitor my email carefully. If anything happens, any problems come up, just email me. Hopefully, no one will have any respondus issues. But the good part of taking it on a weekday, will easily get support. Let me stop the recording.